Now I'm going to define some central concepts in the philosophy of time, namely time, simultaneity, now, past, and future. These are ambiguous terms that people often use without specifying what they mean, and that can lead to some confusion. But I'm going to now say what I mean with these terms, and then hopefully that will you'll see that that's useful later. Because later we'll be discussing arguments for and against different understandings, but now I need first to clarify what I mean by the terms. We'll start with the word time, and I say that this is typically used in 4 different ways that we should distinguish from each other. The first is what I think of as the central content of the concept of time, namely motion. That's a big discussion we'll get back to. Some will say that time is something irreducible. Even if all motion and movement stops, time will continue to pass. Whereas I say that time is reducible to motion, so that if everything, absolutely everything stops, then time stops as well. We also use the word time for measurements of motion. That can be either hypothetically, it can be done in different ways. So you can take one rotation of the Earth, divide it into 24 pieces, call them hours, and you can divide that into 60 minutes or 60 seconds, etc. And could it be done in different ways? And even if no humans existed, we can imagine that hypothetically we could have divided this motion into time units. There's also the actual measurement of time, then, when someone says now 2 hours have passed. Finally, we sometimes also talk about time for our conscious experience of time passing, that there is motion in the world. So that's a 4th meaning to distinguish from the others. When it comes to simultaneity, we have already said quite much about that, so it's just a brief recap here. 2 or more events can be determined by one person as occurring at the same time, as measured by their in their reference frame. But it's useful to specify the reference frame, because sometimes people will disagree on what happens simultaneously depending on what reference frame they are in. And sometimes it's not definable in certain physical theories what happens simultaneously, but it's nevertheless possible to define it philosophically, as we saw in the previous video with these thought experiments about cameras all over the universe. When it comes to now, that's a contested word, and we'll get back to it later, but this is the first introduction. So it's not controversial that the word now locates a speaker in time. So it's an index word, like here can locate a speaker in space, and now can locate the speaker in time. And if we want to define it relative to the speaker, then it can be either when you can act, now I can act, or when you're conscious. So it's useful here to make that distinction, since sometimes you can act even if you're not conscious, or sometimes you are conscious but you can't act, but you can have this experience of it being now. But the eternalist will say that here and now are there's no difference between these as index words. So there's nothing unique about here. People can say here if they're standing here or there, and they will say there's nothing unique about now. People will say now in 1950 and 2000, and they're all existing in the same way in the block universe. But the presentists say that no, there's only one unique now existing, and then it ceases to exist and a new unique now takes over. So there's something very special about now, according to the presentist. It's useful to distinguish also between a physical now, which is what's happening in the universe as it exists according to the presentist, and then that gives us an experience of how the world is, but that happens 80 milliseconds roughly later, because the brain, it takes in information, puts it together, and so what you experience as being the universe now is how the universe was 80 milliseconds before your conscious experience. So that's the reason to distinguish between a physical now and a conscious now when we're talking about the content. Is there a way to define or determine what is physically now? Well, you can say, well, it's the values that are actualized, but that's quite circular. It's just saying something else would say more. What that which exists now is now. That doesn't help us much. But according to the presentists, we can say that, well, the age of the universe, for instance, tells us what is now. It's not the same to say that, well, and the universe is 5 billion years old and 10 billion years old, because the universe is that at different places in the block universe, the eternalists would say, but the presentists would say there's one true answer about what is the age of the universe, because the age of the universe now is 13.8 billion years. And that's not very precise, but it's more precise if we say, if we want to know when is physical now, we can say, well, it's the time since we defined the birth of Jesus. And so you can check your PC or calendar clock, etc., and say, well, now is, when I'm speaking now, it's May 8th, 2023, 10:15. So that's when the physical now was, just a few seconds ago. And they will say that there's one true answer to how long is it since the birth of Jesus. But the eternalists, of course, will not accept this. They will say that, well, this is what everyone says at their point in the block universe. We're just standing at this point and saying this is now. But there's no difference between our now and what people 50 years ago, which is another place in the block universe, will say is now. But the presentist disagrees and says there is only one universe. There isn't this block universe. There's one universe, and this universe causes the conscious experience of the time, which is now. So they do not all exist at the same time. There's only one at a time, says the presentist. So this is a disagreement where you need to look at different arguments for and against the different views to determine whether there's a unique now or all nows are the same. How can we explain that we have this experience of now flowing through history? Well, the way I understand it is to say that, well, there's one universe, because I'm a presentist, and there's a lot of brains. They're configured in a certain way, which gives us now a experience of being conscious. But then, next millisecond, universe changes, brains changed, and you get a new conscious experience of what is now. We'll get back to the exact measuring of how long and now lasts, etc. That's later. Now I just said millisecond in a very imprecise way. There is then this stream of consciousness, different experiences of it being now, and they replace each other and gives us this feeling then that time is passing, or a now is flowing through history. But physically, what happens is then certain physical configurations of values, they replace others. Brains in the world are like this now, and we are different humans experience now is now, and then all our brains change, and we get a new experience of now is now. And that's the explanation of why we feel that now is moving or time is passing. When it comes to past and future, the eternalist says that they all exist in the same way, whereas the presentist says that only now exists. So how can the presentists talk about past and future? What does that mean? Well, there are these nows then replacing each other, and we can talk about the past as how the universe was configured before. And what does before then mean? Well, we just have to then define different motions that we can use to describe that. For instance, then we can say that, well, 2 years ago, that's 2 orbits around the sun for the Earth, or 730 Earth rotations, because 365 plus 365 is 730. So that's what we mean by 2 years ago. But we can't change the past, and the explanation for the present is because there is it doesn't exist. There's nowhere to go to change the past. Hypothetically, an eternalist could say, well, we can move around in a block universe and change the past. That doesn't make sense for the presentist, because it doesn't exist. And the future doesn't exist either. It's just a way of expressing that what exists in the now can be configured in different ways. So there are different physical ways of changing, and some of those might be actualized to become the new now. That we call that the future, but it's just these physical different ways of configuring or making something happen in the one existing universe. Good. We'll return to discussions about how to understand past, future, now, and time in later videos, but this was the first presentation of how I understand these concepts.